We were very fortunate in the 70s, though, because some very smart people like Jerry Bruner began to really say, okay, how do infants learn? And one of the things that Bruner said was that a fundamental feature of learning, maybe the most fundamental feature of learning for social learning in people, is to be able to pay attention to the same object or idea with somebody else at the same time. And so we're all doing that right now. You're trying to pay attention to the ideas that I'm expressing and the ideas that are up on the board. We're coordinating our attention for this next 40 minutes to thoughts about joint attention and autism. If you weren't coordinating your attention, if you were looking somewhere else or listening to something else in an earpiece, you wouldn't learn anything here because you wouldn't pay attention, you wouldn't coordinate attention. So ultimately, when we get to be, 5, 6, 7, we're really, really adept at coordinating attention with other people. So for example, let's say you're driving down a road and there's a lot of traffic and it's congested, but you're still going fast and you're really having to concentrate on the road. But over to the side, you see 20 people standing on the sidewalk looking up and pointing. What's going to happen? You're going to have a strong urge to look over there. Even though it's counterproductive, maladaptive, you're going to have a strong urge to pay attention to what other people are attending to. By the time we become young children, and certainly adults, that we are compelled to pay attention to what other people attend to. It becomes part of our biological system of orienting, visual orienting, and it serves a great purpose. Because more often than not, important information in the environment is indicated by where other people look. But babies don't come into the world with that skill. They have to develop it really slowly. They don't have to develop it really slowly. They do develop it really slowly. And Bruner was one of the first people to recognize that. And he said that it wasn't until about 6 months that babies could really coordinate their attention with somebody else. And then it really took another 12 months to fully develop that skill. And he called that joint attention. And he said that we'll talk about why that's important for learning, but he said that that was critical for learning. So let's just talk about joint attention. There's different types. One is a baby, and we're looking at 8-month-olds following the attention of a partner while they look to the left or right. And so, if you can see this, here we have Amy Vaughn pointing to the left, and this little 8-month-old can follow. The 8-month-old can even follow behind, right? So by about 8 to 9 months, babies are really pretty good at this for the most part. Not perfect, but they get pretty good at it. The other thing that infants can do is they can initiate coordinating attention with someone else. And we do this all the time. If you go to a concert or to the theater with somebody and you see something that you really like, instead of continuing to look at something that you really like, you'll turn and look at somebody else to share the experience with somebody else, right? That's initiating joint attention. And babies pick up on this pretty early on so that you can put an interesting toy out there and they'll spontaneously look to the tester and then look back, even if the tester's not saying anything. And we're very careful to control that sort of thing. So again, we can see a baby, really young baby, look at a toy, look at the tester, and then look back. So there's two types: responding to joint attention, following somebody else's gaze, initiating joint attention, using your own gaze to indicate, oh, that's an interesting thing to look at. Just like there's expressive and receptive language, this kind of attention maps right onto that. A receptive kind of attention to coordinate social attention with others, and an initiating component. So one thing that we found very early, and again, this is one of those things that came out late in the 70s, a guy named Frank Curcio went into a classroom, observed, I think they were 8 to 13-year-old children with autism, and said, gosh, this notion that these kids aren't very communicative is wrong. They're making a lot of eye contact, they're using a lot of gestures to communicate with people, but what they're not doing is they're not either following the gaze of other people or they're not spontaneously initiating social attention coordination. At that point in time, it was called a proto-declarative, initiating joint attention. A declarative being, see that? Proto meaning, no, see that, just using a gesture, right? The kids weren't doing that. And so he was the first person to say, oh, I think this joint attention, there might be a problem specific to joint attention in children with autism. And then the rest of us followed along. In the mid-'80s, we did more precise tests comparing children with autism to children with Down syndrome, to children with disorders that slowed down development but weren't related to autism. And we found that joint attention was the thing that really, really was different with children with autism. We found some interesting things. Social interaction is the degree to which a child with autism, or any child, will make eye contact and engage in turn-taking in a physical interaction. So I would reach across the table and tickle a child and pull my hands back, and as often as not, a child with autism would make eye contact and reach for me to do it again. Children with autism would also request. They'd reach for things and make eye contact. We found in this study, which was a 1986 study, that there was no difference in eye contact for children with autism. And that's been replicated many times. Hard to hear that in the literature. When you look at all the eye contact a child makes in a social interaction, there isn't much of a difference. The eye contact is in spontaneously sharing experience with an event. And that type of behavior, in our study, discriminated 96% of the kids with autism from the children with developmental disturbance or typical development. Jerry Dawson came out, did a much larger study, found almost exactly the same thing. That this one behavior, alternating gaze, which we know gets really set up by 9 months of age, that is a super strong diagnostic symptom of autism. Kids with autism don't do it very frequently, or not frequently enough, let's say. The other thing that we found out in the 80s was, okay, so we've got this following of gaze, and we've got this initiating of attention coordination. Well, young children under 30 months of age, mental age, and now from sibling studies, we know that this is true for chronological age as well. Young children with autism show deficits in both, but after about 30 months, they go on only to show deficits in initiating joint attention. And this is so well understood now that if you remember, Irva talked about the ADI, the Autism Diagnostic Inventory, and the ADOS, the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. Well, those gold standard measures took these measures and even these terms, responding to joint attention and initiating joint attention, and brought them right into their assessments. And in the ADOS, you no longer use responding to joint attention in the second module for older children, because we know the kids with autism pick up on this. They can follow gaze eventually. They still don't show a lot of this initiating attention coordination. That's a pretty important thing. We'll come back to that in a second. The other thing that we understood pretty quickly was that this wasn't related to attachment. You know, one of the things that people thought in the 80s, still do in some parts of the world, is that autism was an attachment disorder, that children with autism had a pervasive, the initial diagnostic for the social disturbance of autism was a pervasive lack of responsiveness to others. That's what we used from 1980 through 1986. That's what most people were trained on in the generations that have gone on to be the diagnosticians for autism. And that turned out not to be true at all. Children with autism show attachment to their caregivers. They can actually use modeling for learning. They do a variety of things. The notion that this is a pervasive deficit stays with us, but it's probably not a pervasive deficit. For one reason, how can you have 59% of the kids be high-functioning kids, have typical cognitive development, and call it a pervasive developmental disorder? That term, pervasive developmental disorder, came from that notion that there was a pervasive lack of responsiveness to others. That turned out not to be true. It was terribly misleading for a long, long time. One of the things that we did understand, though, was children with autism will do this kind of sharing attention, but when they do it, they don't smile very much. They don't smile nearly as much as typical kids. The proportion of smiling in these initiating joint attention bids is way down. So that begins to make you think, okay, so eventually it's just an initiating deficit. So what's an initiating deficit? When you initiate something, it means you have to be motivated to do it. You don't do something spontaneously unless you have some motivation to do it. And then we see that kids with autism, when they do it, they're not smiling very much. So we began to think that at least some part of this disturbance was a motivational disturbance. For some reason, it wasn't so interesting or enjoyable for them to spontaneously share experience with other people. Okay? So why is that important? Why is any of this important? Well, when in the first 2 years of life, you learn pretty much in what are called incidental learning situations. So, somebody doesn't sit down with you and say, okay, John, today we're going to learn cutlery in the kitchen. This is a fork, this is a knife, this is a spoon, let's do it again, fork, knife, spoon. You just don't do it that way, right? Kids somehow spontaneously pick up on language. And there's lots and lots of different cognitive processes that are involved. In fact, we now know that 3-month-olds process the difference in phonemes in their sleep and learn how to discriminate them in their sleep. So there's lots and lots of processes. But I'm going to talk to you about a pretty important one. It's joint attention. So oftentimes we're in situations, the cheeky rooster, this is Dare Baldwin. She was in England when she developed this little illustration. Often we're in situations where there is a toddler or an infant, and their caregiver's presenting them an opportunity to learn a new word, but they're not going over and picking it up and saying, microphone. They're saying, oh, look at the shiny microphone. So how does the infant know that that's what the microphone is? Because they go, oh, look at the shiny microphone. So the infant now has an opportunity to structure their own learning environment. If they can look to the eyes of their caregiver, they can at least narrow the area of the environment to look in for this new word, this new thing that they might learn about. And when they do that, when they look, they follow gaze, they can constrain what's called referential mapping errors. They're much more likely to get the right connection between object and word, less likely to get the wrong connection between object and word. But they have to do it. They have to play a role in the learning process. They have to be active. Now, similarly, even more so, if the child engages in a spontaneous joint attention bid, they go, and then they look at the caregiver and then look back. I mean, the caregiver is going to be a fool not to label at that point and say, yes, that's a microphone, right? Or if the baby were to pick it up, it's a pretty poor caregiver that says, oh, I don't care, right? You label it. And so the baby creates the opportunities that are maximally likelihood to allow them to learn. So there's a lot of learning. The learning environment is a transactional process. The caregiver has to be sensitive, but the baby also has to be able to create or maximize the learning opportunity.